I graduated with a BCom ISM and been working kind of in the industry for a while now. And yeah, and we're gonna kind of get into Firebase, what it is, how you use it, etc., and where Specno has used it before. So I'm gonna ask that we hold all questions, etc., until after I'm done with the talk, and then once we're done with the talk, then we're gonna have a short break, and then we're gonna get started with the practical. During that short break, you guys are more than welcome to ask some questions, and I can get involved and maybe see if I can answer some of your questions. All right. So Firebase. First, we're gonna get into a quick little history overview. Sorry, I've got my notes here. It's the startup. Firebase started from a different startup called Involve. What Involve was a company that developed an API that web developers could use to integrate chat functionality into their website. But what these developers found was that this API was used by developers instead to send and receive data in their application synchronized in real time. And this kind of, proves that your end users can be, the most unpredictable element in any system. So they evolved from Involve to Firebase. So they had the brilliant idea to separate the real-time synchronization functionality and packaged it with a database management system. And thus, Firebase and Firebase Real-Time Database was born. So this kind of brings us to 2012. So in April, they officially launched. And a month after launch, May, they managed to raise 1.1 million in seed capital. Now that's a pretty substantial amount to gain in seed capital. And this kind of got the ball rolling for them, because in 2013, they then managed to raise a further 5.6 million US dollars. So after all that funding and a good number of years of work, they managed to add 2 additional services to their repertoire, their Firebase hosting and Firebase Authentication. We will get into what those things are a little later in the talk. So Firebase was doing clearly well in the industry, making a lot of money, etc. So this kind of piqued the interest of Google, because in October of 2014, Google acquired Firebase. And so began the journey that Firebase and Google had. They began refining and integrating Firebase into the Google platform. As of 2016, they had integrated a number of Google platforms, cloud services into Firebase, and more prominently positioned Firebase as a backend as a service. And they kind of became this unified backend as a service platform. But what does backend as a service actually mean, though? So to engage with what backend as a service is, we first have to define what a backend is. And if you look at, if you try and Google the definition for the backend, the backend can be roughly defined as everything that the end user cannot directly interact with. So this could be server hosting a website, a database housing user information, an API, or other cloud services. So it's a fairly broad umbrella term that can house a large number of system aspects. It's very large umbrella. So given the definition of the backend, we can then define what a front end is. Front end is obviously then everything that the end user can directly interact with. Some will often refer to the front end as client side and the back end as server side, if that helps the definition. So as you can see, there's a discernible difference or separation between the front end and the back end. However, it's unlikely that you'll have one without the other. What the separation means for any company is extra responsibility and extra skill set requirements. Reason being that you have to have devs that will be capable of front end work and devs capable of back end work. Yes, devs can fulfill both roles, but those are 2 different skill sets. So this is where backend as a service comes in. Backend as a service shifts the backend responsibility from the developer to a cloud-based vendor. And in this case, Firebase would be that cloud-based vendor. The developer can then simply hook into the already established framework and its pre-written software to drive their application without hassle. So this reduces the extra responsibility and skill set requirements on your application and tech stack. You're then able to focus a lot more on building your application. This will greatly reduce the time and resource investment needed to transform an idea into an application. All right, so if you were going to set up your backend, we can move on to a couple of considerations that you need to have when you're going to set up your backend. So there are a good number of things that you need to think about when you're engaging with a backend. So we can think about web hosting, database, and cloud services. A number of these points can be applied across the board. So I tried my best to separate them out into the most appropriate categories that I could find. So with web hosting, physical server software and hardware, its location. So if serving local or international clients, SSL certification, so that means HTTP versus HTTPS, deployment pipelines, malicious DOS attacks, etc. There's a large number of things that we can engage with. Now, I'm not trying to, I'm not against setting up a backend. There's always going to be a use case for your own custom ecosystem. I just think it's worthwhile having an insight into what a backend could demand from you. So now we know what it takes to set up a backend. What does Firebase provide as a backend as a service? So Firebase provides there's some very standard stuff that Firebase provides, and then there's some more integrated functionality that Firebase provides. So Firebase provides authentication, so that means your users logging in, logging out, and creating their accounts. They offer 2 database solutions, Cloud Firestore and real-time database. We'll get into what those 2 different things mean, probably more in the practical side, or if you want to ask a question afterwards, you can go ahead and ask that. File storage, uploading, deleting, retrieving, web hosting, so they host your website, and they allow for API solutions as well. Then in terms of alternative things that Firebase also provides, they provide machine learning, quality control, Google Analytics, messaging, ad integration, and A/B testing. A lot of these alternative things that Google provides is because Firebase is backed by Google. So let's have a look at Firebase and its value proposition. Firebase is incredibly intuitive. It's an incredibly intuitive platform. So most of what they provide, the things that we looked at earlier, are generally a couple clicks away from being enabled and ready to use. It's easy to use and implement. So what that means is that using Firebase and its Firebase SDK is a fairly simple process. And yeah, it's brilliant. And then integrated ecosystem, as I said, it's backed by Google. So what that means is that your login flows can flow through like OAuth. They handle everything. So if you have a Google account and you're interacting with an application that's backed by Firebase, your login process is much easier for your users. It's also backed by a tech giant, obviously it's backed by Google. And what this means for Firebase is that it'll have longevity and it'll continue to evolve as time goes on. It's got an active community and developers. I just do have to take a moment to punt Fireship. If you are ever interested in getting into Firebase and using Firebase, Fireship is a brilliant YouTube channel that probably taught me more Firebase content than any other YouTube channel. And he really is a pillar in the Firebase community. The documents, it's extremely well documented, very simple to follow. Yeah. Extensions, so Firebase also recently came out with extensions at the end of 2019, and that's probably going to be a marketplace that grows. So along with all the other things that Firebase provides, they are going to come out with user-generated content. And then another really nice point is a generous free tier. And we'll be engaging with this free tier in the practical demonstration following the talk. So getting started with Firebase, what do you need? What can it interact with? What can it not interact with? Your step 1 is always going to be creating a Firebase project, and that will be on the Firebase console. Your step 2, it really depends on what platform you're likely to start with. But your step 2 will be downloading the Firebase SDK. Then if you know, on one of the three major platforms, so if you're on Android, iOS, or JavaScript, it's a fairly simple process. They have documentation surrounding this as well. You can download the Firebase SDK and integrate it into one of those three languages. Or if you'd like to integrate it into a server that you already have set up in Node.js, Java, Python, Go, or .NET, you can go ahead and do that as well. They also support Unity and C++ development. However, you need to make sure that it's backed by native Android or an iOS framework. So where has Specno used Firebase? So Specno is used, if we can start with Talisman. Talisman is an online credit application, and we use Firebase to host the web page, save uploaded documents as well as form data so that their point of sale systems can call it via an API. It then fully integrated with their system using callable cloud functions, kind of like APIs, to validate the user and allow them to make calls. So it's authentication and a whole bunch of other things. Then we had Jumping Fox. Jumping Fox was a school fee exemption platform. It included kind of fee exemption applications and management. So it was similar to Talisman. We also used Firebase to host the platform, authorization, save uploaded documents, and to save user data and application data. Then Skudu, probably arguably our biggest platform that we've used it on. It's a agri-tech and e-commerce platform. We make use of hosting, authorization, the storage bucket, Google Analytics, API, and essentially almost every in-house Firebase tool. Yeah, so that's kind of the end of the talk. Is there any questions that anyone does have? Yeah. I'm not sure if you're able to talk. Would it be put in chat then, if I'm not mistaken? Let me see if I can find the chat. Okay.
Anyone can ask any questions in the chat, or if it's easier to unmute, then you can unmute.
Yeah, that'll work just as well. Okay, that's all good. I know we said we were going to take a break at this point in time, so we're probably going to move on to the practical side of things. You guys must just make sure that you've cloned that repo, and then we can get started with the practical side. Yes, yes. So Firebase does support the .NET framework. So as I said earlier, if your server is coded in .NET, you can then integrate the Firebase SDK. And obviously then the Firebase SDK will interact directly with the Firebase platform. Do you use callable cloud functions if you need to build backend functionality that Firebase does not provide? You can 100% go ahead and do that. If you can achieve it in your language of choice that Firebase supports, then for sure you can build that extra functionality and put it in a callable cloud function. All right, so we're going to move on to the. If we use Firebase, does that mean that we don't need a backend developer? I don't think you'd ever be able to cut out someone who understands the backend 100%. It greatly reduces the requirement of the backend developer. So you can then have a front-end developer that understands some of the aspects of Firebase. You'll see that in the practical side of things, a lot of the time, your front-end developer is going to be interacting with the Firebase SDK. So you actually may not necessarily need a backend developer, but it's always most likely worthwhile to have one. Your backend developer will also help with your data architecture, etc. So there's, it's possible. All right. Okay, right. So step one, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be creating your Firebase project. So you're going to want to navigate to the Firebase platform, and you want to obviously log in. I've already logged in, so I'm not going to need to do that. You can click go to console, and then you're just going to add a project. So actually we can create a project name here. So we're going to name this 0 to hero. All right, we can continue. So for the time being, we're not gonna create a Google Analytics account. Apologies, sorry. We're not going to integrate Google Analytics into the project that we create here. It requires a Google Analytics account, and I'm not going to assume that you have one of those. So we can just go ahead and create the project. So it takes a short duration to start the project, and then we can start enabling a couple of things that we want to use. So for the practical demonstration, we're going to look at hosting, authorization, and reading and writing to a database. I'll get into kind of the database choice kind of as we get into it. All right, so we now have this kind of project overview. This is kind of where everything happens, where all the magic happens. So we're going to start with authentication. So we're going to enable our authentication first and make sure that we can use it in our application. So obviously we don't have any current users, but we need to set up the Google OAuth provider. So you go into authentication, sign in method, and then we just go over to Google and you click enable, and that's basically it. And then you just need to set up a project support email. But that email, you'll just kind of get emailed if anything happens with your project. So we can just go ahead and save that. So then we're going to get into our database. So you have two options to choose from when you're engaging with Firebase. You've got your Cloud Firestore, and then you have your real-time database. For most projects, I would suggest that you use the Cloud Firestore. The real-time database kind of is more of a throwback to their older system that they had, and is more for multiplayer games. So if we can create a database, and that's fine, and I can just show you what the data looks like. The real-time database is basically a very large JSON tree, and what it prioritizes here is it prioritizes minimum latency. So this would be perfect for a game that relies on up-to-date information. Whereas we're going to be working with Cloud Firestore because we're going to be working with authorization and other collections and documents, etc. You'll see. So we're just going to go ahead and enable our cloud, our database. You could choose a region that you want your database in. So I just chose US Central. That's not really a huge issue where you put your database. All right, so we now have a Cloud Firestore set up. Now, to work with Cloud Firestore, you need to understand two concepts. Number one, we have collections, and number two, we have documents. So if you could think of Cloud Firestore as a filing cabinet, your collections are folders, your documents are like files, and then on that file, you'll have your data, so your fields. That's where all your information is stored. And then with your collections, you can also have sub-collections. So that would be a folder within a folder. So that's one kind of hurdle to modeling your data that you need to bear in mind that it's in that structure. And then we're going to go ahead and enable our hosting. I actually don't think anything needs to particularly happen this side. Okay, cool. So we can start moving towards our code. So if we open up our code, all we need to run, I've assumed that you've run already Firebase Login, but I'll show you what should happen. So if we call Firebase Login, you'll see that my name should pop up. So you can see I'm already logged in as in my email. So we can just say Firebase init. So this CLI, so this is using the Firebase CLI, which is very, very useful. So we're just gonna, proceed. We're gonna set up, obviously, because we're using the Firestore. So we're gonna go Firestore, hosting, and I think that's actually it. Authorization, yeah, we don't need authorization, it's already set up. And then we're gonna use an existing project. So we already set up that project now. So we can go ahead and choose the project. So it's gonna load in all the projects that I have under my name. And we can see that we've got 0 to hero. So we can just hit enter. And that should set up all your files for you. And then it'll ask you a couple questions. It's usually for naming purposes, but you don't necessarily need to rename any of those things. And then, so this is kind of more towards Angular. Do you want to configure your single page? Do you want to configure your application as a single page application? And the answer for that is kind of, I think, particular to Angular. So I'm not sure what this applies to, how this applies to any other framework, but for now, we're just going to go with yes. So we're going to say yes. There you go. And now we have Firebase initialized in our application. There are a couple things that you do need to do in your Angular app to properly initialize Firebase, but I've already done that. So we're going to start to look at authorization. So we want to make sure that our user's able to log in, right? So if we open up our app, we go to components, we can see we've got a login component. So the login component is obviously where our user's going to log in, etc. So we're going to try and handle the authorization on this side of things. Along with Firebase, the Firebase SDK, they also provide a drop-in auth solution. It's called Firebase UI, and it's usually for web applications. And as I said, it's a drop-in auth solution. So you install the package, and then you can use their existing code to create a login screen for you. So our first step is we need to initialize the Firebase UI. So this is going to allow the drop-in auth solution to find an element and then populate that element with their login stuff. So we are going to go to the Firebase UI service first. So obviously all our Firebase UI functions are going to be in here, and this is where we're going to call everything from. So I've just abstracted it into a service. It's just better practice that way. So there is one thing that is unique to Angular. Because we already have a Firebase instance, we use something called Angularfire, and it creates a Firebase instance. And because that instance already exists in our project, we need to pass that instance to Firebase UI so it knows that there's an already existing Firebase instance and that it doesn't have to create it. So what we're going to do is we've got this variable, Firebase UI auth instance, and we're just going to return that variable. So we say return. We're going to return the variable. Or we're going to check first. We're going to say, okay, does that instance exist? If it does exist, then we're just going to return a promise. So promise.resolve. So I'll explain this. So we're just checking if the instance already exists. If it does exist, then we're just returning that instance. Otherwise, we're going to grab the instance, the already existing instance. So we're going to return a new promise. And then in this promise, we need to get that Firebase instance that we have already in our application. So we're going to make a try catch. And then I'll just go through and explain what that code is. All right, so the app instance. So we use Angularfire. So as I said earlier, we use Angularfire, which is the Angular implementation of Firebase. It just allows a couple of things a lot easier for Angular to interact with. We get the app, which is the Firebase instance. We get that in, and then we just assign that instance. So this.firebaseui.auth.authUI, and we pass through the app instance that we get here. So I'm curious if this should work. Let's see if that initializes actually. Oh, and then obviously we're going to need to call that function. So here we're just assigning a subscription, and we need to listen to that subscription so we can close it later. We then say, okay, this.firebase UI service. We need to initialize that Firebase UI instance, and then we subscribe to the result, and then the result will return whether or not the Firebase UI has loaded or not. So we can go ahead and serve that. This is obviously Angular specific. So ng-serve kind of builds an Angular application into your memory and then forwards it to a particular port. Apologies. So it might take some time to serve, but that's fine. Once that's served, then we can just leave it served and it will update as the content kind of comes through. Okay, so we do have an error, that's fine. Let's see if that's actually serving though. All right, no, it's not serving, that's fine. So we just need to solve that error and then it should serve fine. Oh, okay, correct. Not that. All right, sorry. So we got that auth instance. I then need to initialize the Firebase UI. I left that off, I apologize. So we then just going to go ahead and call this.get Firebase UI auth. And then that should return a promise, and that promise will be the Firebase UI instance that we need. So then we can just say .then, and that'll return the auth instance. Then using that auth instance, we can just, very simple to run. We just say auth instance.start. Then in start, we pass it a reference to an element in your HTML. So if we have a look at our login component, we can see that we've got this ID here. So the Firebase UI is going to grab that ID and then it's going to throw in its stuff. We then need to throw some configurations into the mix before any of that will work. So we need to define the sign-in options and what happens if that sign-in is successful or if it fails. So I'll just go through. Okay. So we have sign-in options. For now, we're just going to support the Google Auth provider. So that's just going to be your Google OAuth. We just pass through the provider ID and then callbacks. So this is important, obviously. So we want to know, did the sign-in succeed? Did the sign-in fail? And has the UI loaded? All right, so we need to go and define these callbacks and then we can work with it. Then a sign-in success URL. So what's going to happen is it's going to redirect you to login page. You're going to log in, and then from that page, it'll then redirect to another URL on your web application. So we'll work with sign-in success first. And this is kind of something that you'd have to read in the documentation. But from sign-in success, you can return a Boolean value. And if that Boolean value is true, then Firebase UI will handle the redirect. So then we use this redirect URL. Or if it's false, then it'll ignore this redirect URL and you can handle it in your application as you want. Then sign-in failed. So I've already set up a snack bar service. So that's something that'll just tell us if there was a failure to sign in. And then we're going to have a look at, has the UI shown? So we need to make sure that the rest of our application knows about it. And we can just say, okay. So you don't necessarily need to understand what's going on here. This is a RxJS particular functionality, so you don't necessarily need to be too concerned about it. All that you need to know is that this is an observable, and then we can pass a value to that observable, and that observable will then interact with the rest of our application. I see that we've got a .then, but we don't have a .catch. And then again, we'll just use that snack bar service to inform us if that failed. Now, this actually shouldn't currently work, if I'm not mistaken, and I'll explain why. All right. So we should see that that's not going to work, and I'll explain why. When you set up Firebase in an Angular specific project, we need particular details. And that's so that it can register Firebase in the application. So to do so, you need to go to your Firebase project settings, and you need to get your particular project details. So we need to register an application. So we're obviously going to register a web application. So we can just click here. Doesn't necessarily need to have any particular name. And then we can register that application. What that'll do is that'll then give us some details for the project. You'll see, yeah, this is for using that's to initialize it. Okay, continue console. So we now have some details, and we need these details. So these details will then be used within your Angular application. So what you have to do is you have to register your app and get that config information. So we can then navigate to our project again, and then we need to populate that information in our environments folder. So you'll see I've already set up that Firebase config, so we're just going to paste that in there. All right, so now you can see that we've got this UI, so this UI button. So we can actually, we can click on that button, and that button should redirect us to a Google Auth login. So as you can see, it takes us through, and then it'll ask me, do I want to log in with my personal email, or do I want to log in with my work email? I'm just going to log in with my personal email for now. See that it's loading, and then when it succeeds or it fails, then we'll know about it, and it'll redirect or not. All right, excellent. So you'll see that this page is currently broken, but we're gonna move on to that and fix that as we kind of go through the application. So you can see that that Firebase UI login solution is very quick to implement, and it's very easy to do. So we're going to go back to the code. We're now going to, so that was using the Firebase UI, and then we're just going to use the Angular Fire. We're going to set up the Angular Fire method to log in as well. So we're going to go back to our login component, and let's just have a look what we need to set up. So we need to set up signing in with Google. So this is going to be using our Firestore. So that'll our Firebase. I have named the service Firestore, but that's your Firebase service. So we need to set up a sign in with Google method that we've got here. So we're going to say this dot Firestore service dot sign in with Google, and then we're going to define what happens in that function in the service. So if we navigate back to our service, our Firestore service, let's find sign in with Google. All right. So here we've got the function. We need to find what happens here. So we'll be using So this, again, this is going to be using Angularfire, but it's very close to the default Firebase SDK package that you will be using. So to sign in with Google, we need to tell Firebase that we want to use the Google Auth provider. So what we want to do is we just set up a variable. So your Google Auth provider, Firebase. This is using the Firebase SDK, and we grab a Google Auth provider, and that just gets us an instance of that provider. So then we just say, okay, so this is using Angularfire, but very similar to the Firebase SDK. So Firebase, this .angularfire auth.sign in with popup, and then we provide the provider, and then from that we get user credentials. Those credentials can obviously then be used throughout your application. You get stuff like your user ID, display name, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Obviously, using the SDK, it's not going to provide any of the redirecting for you, so you'll have to do that yourself. So we can go ahead and save that change and then head back to the login. So that should now work. And then we do need to check if the user is already logged in. So with the whole authorization process in your application, you care about whether or not your user is already logged in. And if your user is already logged in, we don't necessarily want them to see the login screen. So what we'll do is we will subscribe to the auth state, and that is a part of the Firebase SDK. And it will basically tell you whether or not your user is currently logged in or not. So all that we need to do is we use the Angularfire auth library. So we have this .angularfire auth. We say .auth state, and then .subscribe. So that'll then listen to the auth state in your application. Again, because it's a subscription, we need to be handling our subscriptions and unsubscribing, but that is a web-specific issue. So we subscribe to that. So whenever auth state changes, we'll then know about it. So then we'll get an instance of a user, and then we're just going to check, if this user is logged in. If this user is logged in, then we're going to navigate to our to-do list. So then let's just check if that's working. All right, so we already, so you'll see that it's just going to kick me out to the to-do list because we are already logged in. We already logged in, I already logged in with my personal email, so it's just going to kick us here. So what we can do, we'll see that it should populate your local storage with some user information. And then we're just going to delete that database, and that'll delete the instance of us being logged in. All right. So if we go back to login, it shouldn't kick us out then. Excellent. Didn't kick us out. All right, so now we can try the standard Firebase SDK login method. So we can just say sign in with Google. This is going to bring up a pop-up. And then again, I'm going to be able to select either my personal account or my work account. So I'm just going to go with my personal account. And then once that's logged in, because we listen to that auth state, it's then just going to push us through to the to-do list. So now we're done with that login flow. Now we're kind of going to move on to logging out, or at least enabling that logout functionality. So I don't have to delete that information every single time. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through to our navbar component. So our navbar component is going to have our sign out button. So it's just going to have our little sign out button, click that, and then you'll be able to sign out. And so we're going to subscribe to that auth state. We need to subscribe to that auth state here, and then we need to sign out here. All right. So signing out is probably one of the easiest things that you can do in Firebase. We're going to just use the Firestore service. So we'll say this.firestore service, and then we're just going to call .signout. And then I'll show you how that implementation works. So we're just going to navigate to our Firestore service and we look for sign out. All right. So signing out is, as I said, a very simple process. You use, again, the Angularfire library, angularfire.auth, and then we're just going to call .signout. And then this is going to return a promise. You can then use that promise to navigate or confirm whether or not the user actually did sign out. So we'll just say a .then, since it's a promise. We'll then, if it is successful, we'll redirect to whatever redirect URL we passed it, and we'll just say successfully signed out or failed to sign out. So then we've got that sign out done, and then we want to subscribe to the auth state. And the reason we want to subscribe to the auth state here is because we want to get the name for the user that's currently logged in, and then display that on the top bar. So again, we're going to be using the Angularfire library. So this Angularfire auth, we're going to subscribe to that auth state again. Just call .subscribe. And then, as I've said before, because it's a subscription, we do need to handle that subscription and deal with it later. So then all we're going to do is we're just going to listen to the auth state. We'll get an instance of that user. If there is no user, then the person's not going to be logged in. And if we want to get the display name, you'll see that the user already has a display name property. Because Firebase is strongly typed in a language like TypeScript or JavaScript, you should be able to get a couple details about that user. So we can see their display name, email, whether or not the email's been verified, their ID token, whether or not it's an anonymous sign-in, some metadata, phone number, photo URL, etc., etc., etc. And there's a couple of things that you can interact with here. So then if we navigate back, or if we go back to our application, we should see that my name should pop up, and then it'll have a little button, and this will sign out. And that is officially authorization in your application set up. That's done. You've got your login, you've got your logout, and you can listen to your auth state within your application. So it's a very simple process to go through. All right, so I'm just going to log in again, and then we're going to move on to reading and writing data. All right, so it's currently going to say loading to-dos. I don't think that'll change. That's because we still have to set up some information or some functions within the application. So what we're going to do is we're going to navigate to our to-do component. And then we should find it here. And there's a lot of functions that we're going to end up defining here, but we'll get through it. All right, so first of all, we want to check, is the user logged out? Because if they are logged out, then we should kick them back to the login screen, because they shouldn't be here. So we'll just use this .Angularfire auth. Again, we're going to be listening to the auth state. And then we're going to use auth state, and we're going to subscribe to that. And then obviously, if the auth state doesn't return a user, then we know that the user isn't currently logged in. So we'll see, I think I can't test this actually. Maybe not, that's fine. We'll just leave it at that. So that'll kind of be like so it'll just ensure that logged out users don't have access to that to-do screen. All right, so then we're going to start looking at reading data. So we're going to navigate to our Firestore service. So we want to make sure that when the user logs in, that we get the most up-to-date information for that user, and maybe some to-dos that relate to that user. So we're going to subscribe to the auth state again, and then we are going to subscribe to the Firestore collection. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So I'm not going to kind of bother going through that whole implementation again. We'll just, all right, so we subscribe to that auth state. We then we assign current auth state, and we just assign that as the user. And then we check, okay, if there is a user, then we want to subscribe to the Firestore collection. So when you listen, or when you get data, when you're reading data from Firestore, it's not a normal HTTP request. It's actually a WebSocket. And what that means is that it can constantly emit data multiple times before that observable actually is closed. If you don't have experience in web development, that I'm not sure how else to get that kind of across. So we're then going to move on to listening to the database. So when we want to read data from Firebase, we have to subscribe to that data. So since we know that the user is already logged in, we're going to use some of that user information. So we're going to use this.AngularFire. This time we're not going to use the Angularfire auth, we're going to use Angularfirestore. So it's been separated out into separate modules, or libraries rather, that you can use. And then, to listen or to read that data, we can kind of see. So in our Cloud Firestore, you'll see that we have collections and we have documents. So, we've got the collection. If we start a collection, we can then create a document. So your UI on the Firebase platform is not different to the library. So if we want to listen to a collection, we literally use the Angularfirestore library. Then we just use .collection. We then pass a name. So we're just going to use to-dos as the name of the collection. And then we're going to refer to a document in that collection. So what that means is that our data should currently look like this. So we have to-dos, and then we have a document. So what we're going to do is when we write to our to-dos collection is we're going to use the user's UID to name that document. So when we're reading, we can just use that user's UID to read his current to-dos. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this collection. You don't necessarily need to define a collection before you listen to it or before you write to it on the platform. So if you use the Firebase SDK, it's not going to matter. So then we're going to, so we've got the collection to-dos, and then we're going to use the document. And then in the document, we're going to use the user.uid. So when we subscribe to that auth state, we're going to call subscribe to Firestore collection, and we've passed through that user, and that user will have an ID. So we can just use user.uid. And then obviously that'll reference the user's UID, which will be unique. It'll look something like that. It's a non-guessable UID. Then we're just gonna use, okay, so here's kind of where things get complicated. You can use get, which will only get the document once. So that'll just be a normal HTTP call. However, if you use something like snapshot changes or value changes, then it's going to be a WebSocket connection. And because we want this to be as up-to-date as possible, and because we want this to sync across all our devices, so if I'm using this application on my laptop, or if I'm using this application on my phone, I want to make sure that I get those changes as quickly as possible. So we're going to use a WebSocket, and then we're going to subscribe to that WebSocket. And that will return our to-dos. Then we already have a variable called to-dos in our service. So we'll just go ahead and assign that variable. So this .to-dos is equal to to-dos. We are just going to default to an empty object here. That's a JavaScript speciality. All right. And then I'm just going to do some type safing here. This you shouldn't really care about if you aren't in the web development industry. All right, so now what will happen is we'll then have this up-to-date list of all the users to-dos in a variable in our service. So I think, yeah, here we go. So just kind of so you know, whenever we make changes in Angular, it automatically recompiles and renders those changes. So all those changes that I made now have been rendered. It says, okay, cool. We haven't found any to-dos, go ahead and add one. So our step, how we're going to, interact with these to-dos is we're going to have a header, and then we're going to have a to-do. So the header will contain multiple to-dos, And then, you know, a to-do is going to have some information about it. It's going to have a name and some other information. Let's get into it. All right. So we're going to go to our to-do component. We're then going to have a look at the add header method, and we're going to set this up. We're most likely going to just call, okay, I've already done some work here. So we're going to use like a little dialog component to capture some user input to add that header. I'll just show you what that looks like. So again, I've already set up a couple of these functions, but they have nothing under them, so it's just going to call an empty function. So we can see that when we hit that to-do button, it brings up a little pop-up, then we can throw some text in, and that should go ahead and add the header. We'll go and work on how we're going to achieve that now. All right, so we can just navigate then back to our Firestore service, and we're going to go to add to-do header. So I've kind of lost my place here. All right, so again, I've already implemented a lot of this code, but I'll explain how this works and what's going to happen. So we're going to check first, you know, does that header already exist? If it does exist, then we're going to just kind of open up an error message and say, okay, failed to add an existing header. So we don't want duplicate headers. Then we're going to work with to-dos as a normal object. We're going to create a attribute and assign it to a variable. So if, let's say, our header was groceries, we can then say our to-do is then going to look like this. So we'll have to-do as an object, and then it's going to look like this. And that's your standard JSON format. Then what we're going to do is, once we've made that change, so this is kind of where we're adding the header. We need to save that change, and that change then needs to be reflected to Firebase. So we're then going to use .handleSave, and this is going to be used across the board. So whether we're adding a header, removing a header, adding a to-do, or removing a to-do, we're going to make sure that whenever we make a change, that we save those changes. So again, I've already set this up. This is just a small like utility function. So I've saved on change. For now, we're not going to save our changes. So for now, we're just going to work with kind of without saving to Firebase. We can then look at what that does afterwards. But for now, we're not going to save those changes. So it's going to call basically an empty promise. It's not going to do anything. Not sure why that is. Oh, it's because this is returning a void. Okay. Well, then let's get to saving those changes. So because we're going to be working with a collection, so we have this collection, we have an ID. So when we want to set the data on that document, we know the name of the collection, we know the user's UID. So we can just replace the information that's on this document. So if we go back to the Firestore, we can then say, okay, we're going to again use the Angularfirestore library. So we're going to return that. This.AngularFirestore. We're then going to call the collection. Again, collection is to-dos. Then we're going to get the document. So again, the user should be logged in. So we should have a current auth state. Remember, when we subscribe to that auth state, we assigned that variable. So we can then say, okay, cool. Let's grab that current auth state and let's get the user's UID. So we get that UID, and then very easy to update that is just call set. Set will then return a promise and it'll overwrite that document's changes. You are able to set a couple options here where if you you can merge the data rather than overwriting. But for now, we're just going to overwrite. So we're just going to call set, and then we're going to call the data that that document needs to reflect. And obviously, because we have the to-dos locally, we can then just throw the to-dos in there. This needs to be a global reference. All right, so that should be a successful flow. We're not going to see that reflect to Firebase, but we should see that kind of succeed. So if we go add header, we say new header. It's curious, is that? Anyways, I'm not sure why that didn't work. Oh, are we calling it? I don't think we're calling it in the to-do component. We are, okay. Anyways, we're going to move on. We're going to move on to removing the header. So it's going to be much the same for most of the other functions. So the removing of the header is going to be a similar function. So most of the dog work here is going to be done by JavaScript. And then when you do want to update right, so that should now remove headers. We've got add, remove, and then we're going to move on to adding to-dos and removing to-dos. So again, I mean, most of this is going to be JavaScript-based kind of work rather than your Firebase doing all the work here. So add to-do takes a header, takes some string, and that'll be the text for the to-do. Then when we get that to-do, we're going to use the header that we've got here, and then we're going to push that to-do to that object. Obviously going to have the string, it's going to have is complete, and then it's going to have a UID. So using the Angularfirestore, you can call something called create ID. And that'll give you a completely unique ID to use wherever in your application. Then, like most of the other things that we've done, we can then just go ahead and call this .handle save. Okay, cool. Then we're just going to move on to removing a to-do. Again, kind of the same process, except this time, what we're going to do is we're going to use that UID that we have in that to-do to find our to-do. So because, you know, to-dos can have the same text, we needed the UID as an identifier. So we're going to use a function called .getToDo. Again, this is all JavaScript work, so it's not, none of this is Firebase. So we use the header, we use the UID, and then we find the to-do that matches that UID. Then once we found that to-do, we then just find the index of that to-do and that header, and we remove it. All right, let's see if adding a to-do should work here, or a header. I'm not sure why that's not working. Well, let's follow along. Okay, so we've got the add header. Is that being called? It's being called. All right, so we've got the add header. We check if, oh, this is add to do component. This is not. And that's add to do, not add header. That makes a lot of sense. All right, so that should now work. There we go. Now we see that we've got a header. That's fantastic. We get that little pop-up that says, yes, we've successfully added that header, and that's all cool. We can then look at that to-do. I think that oh, that hasn't been set up yet. Okay, so then we're going to use add to-do. So it's going to be much the same process here, but it's obviously going to be in reference to to-dos rather than headers. So we're just gonna throw this in here. All right. So again, we're just opening up a dialog, so that little pop-up, waiting for it to be closed, getting a promise for that, and then getting the response. That response is going to be text. If that text has a value, then we're going to add that to do. Obviously, it requires the header. That's all done in the HTML. So we don't necessarily need to worry about it here. So we call the service, add the to-do, pass the header and the text, and that should add a to-do. Again, I made sure that those changes weren't saved. So it is currently reading from Firebase, but those changes aren't being saved to Firebase. You can see that there's nothing on Firebase. Yeah. So let's go ahead and add a header. Let's call header, and then let's just add a to-do. There you go. So we can see that we now got this, we have this to-do, and if we click complete, yeah. Oh, that still needs to be done. When we click this button, it should then complete that to-do and prompt you to remove it, should that be done. All right. So we then going to move on to kind of just calling remove header. So remove header, we've already set up in the service, so there's only kind of JavaScript work to be done here. So again, I've already set up a snack bar service. It's just like a confirmation. So it checks, did this user confirm that they want to delete this header? And then it'll go and it will call that header. Then we want to remove to-dos. And then this is just straightforward. We're going to call from the service and call remove to-do. And then here, again, I've abstracted most of this logic into the service. It's just better that way. So if we're going to move to the Firestore service, we need to complete toggle to do is complete. All right. So first off, we're going to get that to do. So we're going to use our get to do method. So we've got the header, we've got the UID, then we can just get that to do. Then we're going to toggle whether or not that to do is complete. We'll just return the negative of its current value. And then we're going to return that save. However, here we're not going to return a success. I think it'll just clog the UI. All right, so that's now all set up. And if we go to the application, let reload, let's add a header, let's add a to-do. And if we toggle it, we should see that that color is now changed, and we can now also remove it. So we click remove, that should then be removed from the list. All right, so now that we've got that all working, I'm going to implement all completed to-dos, and then we can look at those changes reflecting to Firebase. Where is that now? So remove completed to-dos. This is when you look at now. So all to-dos that are complete, we're then just going to remove. So you don't have to click on each individual one. So again, we're going to use a little snack bar here, a little confirmation message. We're going to say remove all to-dos. And if they confirm it, then we're going to call remove all completed to-dos. All right, so we can just navigate to that function. All right, we just need to find this. All right, so this is, again, largely JavaScript related. So it's not, I'll walk through the process, but it's not really too much about the Firebase here. So we just grab the headers, and then for every header that we have, we check if the to-do is complete. And then if it is complete, we kind of filter it out. And then if that header no longer has any to-dos, then we just delete that header. Then obviously we're going to want to save those changes. So we're going to call this this should be handle save. So we're going to call this handle save. All right, so now we have this whole application functioning theoretically obviously without reflected Firebase. So we can just test fire to do. Let's complete that to do and then remove all completed to do. We're going to confirm that. There we go, it's removed. So let's go ahead and then change. Let's enable that saving. So we're going to say true. Ooh. Actually, before that, let's look at persistence. So at the moment, you can see that whenever I refresh the application, that it maintains that logged in state. You can see that it immediately populates there. And that's something that you can set in your Firebase SDK. And then we can go ahead and we can actually set the persistence method. And what that'll mean is that you can choose whether or not to persist that login status. For example, if you've got a secure application where you don't necessarily want to set that that persistence method as basically if you want to limit how much that login status is persisted, then you can use that. So again, we're going to use this .AngularFireAuth. So again, this is for authorization, and we can just set persistence. Very handy. And then we're going to use this .persistence strategy. We've already defined persistence strategy here. You can get the persistence methods from the Firebase SDK. So they provide you with a couple: local, none, or session. So let's go ahead and set it to none for now. And then, of course, because it's because everything's asynchronous that Firebase does, it's going to return a promise. All right. So what will happen is if I reload, you can see that it's kicked me back to the login screen. So let's just log in again. Let's go to my personal account. And then let's refresh and see what happens. Cool. So we can see that it's kicking us back, and that login state is not being kept. So we're going to change that back to local once I've logged in again. Well, actually, it doesn't matter. All right, so we can then change this back to local, so it'll keep that that login state persisted over multiple sessions. Then what we're going to want to do, refresh. Okay. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to start seeing those changes be sent up to Firebase. So we're going to go ahead and enable those changes that we make. So we're going to say change our save on change variable. So it's going to go true. And then at the end of the day, all that's going to happen is we're going to call .collection.document.set. And obviously that returns a promise, and we engage with that. All right, so let's have a look. So let's add a header, household. Let's add a header, feed dog, feed cat. All right, so now that we've got those changes, we should see all of those changes being reflected to the platform. So if I just go ahead and refresh. There we go. So we can see that to-dos collection. We see that user UID, and then we can see the header and the array that houses all the to-dos. We've got the feed dog and we've got feed cat. We can see those UIDs. That's exciting. So we can just go ahead and for now, I'm just going to delete this collection. Okay, so that is long and short of it, kind of how easy it is to implement reading and writing. What we're going to move on to now is actually deploying this application so that other people can use it. So we're going to look at hosting. So we can just say, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So what we need to do first is we need to build the application. Again, this is most likely Angular specific. So we're going to call ng-build prod, and that'll be for production. And then we're just going to wait for that to finish. There are a couple of rules and things that you need to consider when deploying your hosting. So I think what happens here is one of the rules is not here. So we're going to need to add a rule here. So if you open up your firebase.json, we need to set a target. So our target should be, I think, the name of our application. So for here, it's going to be the name of the Firebase application, which is 0 to hero. Let's see if that works. Well, let's see if that works before I set the target, and then we can go ahead and try with adding the target. If you can in the chat, I'm just curious how many of you are involved in web development in some kind, and how many of you actually more interested, who's not involved in web development still watching? I'm just curious as to, you know, I am looking at the chat now. I'm just curious as to know, you know, has this been an interesting talk or insight into Angular? Yeah, just kind of on that topic, actually, Angular is a framework that's created by Google. It's a web development framework, very much like Polymer. I know Polymer has just come out that they've engaged with, or sorry, developed. And yeah, it's very similar and really brilliant kind of web framework. All right, so that's almost done. Just kind of need to wait for that to finish up. Then we'll be using the Firebase CLI to deploy. And again, it's a very straightforward process. We're going to be using Firebase Deploy, and that should deploy to hosting, hopefully. And then what that means is that when you deploy to the web, it's then a live link that anyone can go and visit. So you can take your idea that you have, or your application, or your project, or whatever, using the free tier. Bear in mind, everything that we've done up until this point has been on the free tier. All of setting up the project, using the hosting, using the authorization, using the database is all on the free tier. There are some limitations, but not a lot. We can actually go through that maybe after I'm done deploying. So we should just do Firebase Deploy, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so it's actually deploying. And we can see Firebase. Okay, cool. Now we've got our app. It's been deployed, and we can now follow this link to our deployed app. Now, obviously, anyone on there, I think it's okay. So it hasn't actually deployed our built content. So let's just have a look at that quickly. Sorry, I'm just trying to find. Okay, yeah. So it's not actually targeting our dist folder, which contains our build stuff. So we just need to update that quickly. Yeah, there we go. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. All right. So the public is obviously the public folder that we want to push to the web. So we're just going to go ahead and Firebase deploy again. Hopefully, ooh, sorry, that's wrong. This needs to be 0 to hero. So we can then just run Firebase deploy again. Wait for that to finish. Let's actually explore into the tiers before we have a look at the hosting. So with Firebase, I mean, they provide you a good amount of reads, writes, etc. for free. So it hasn't taken me to the pricing. So there you've got two tiers. You've got your Spark plan, you've got your Blaze plan. Again, it's pay as you go. They provide a lot of their additional stuff that you would think is not free is free. In terms of authentication, pretty generous, 10K authentications per month. I think those are unique in your Firestore. So that's the database that we've been working with. You're allowed a gigabyte in total of data, 10 gigabytes a month, 20 writes a day. 50K reads a day, and then 20K deletes a day. So you're welcome to go through this kind of list in your own time, but I know that I've set up an application for an NGO purely on the Spark plan, and it's actually been sufficient. All right, so that Firebase deploy should be done. So let's see if it's deployed properly now. It's curious. I'm not sure why it's not deploying. Let's have a look. Okay, that's fine. I have already set this up in another project. So we'll just go and move over to that one. So if we go have a look at hosting, this will just load. It should take a couple seconds. There we go. Once it's loaded, you then have access to 2 domains that you can use. They'll usually use a .web.app or a .firebase.app.com. You can also set up custom domains. So if you buy a domain and you want to use that domain, you can use it here. So if we have a look at the application, it's hosted, I can log in. Let's log in with this method. So again, this is a separate project. So what that means is that the content is different. So again, we don't have any content here, so we can add headers, etc., and do everything that we did in our previous application. What that means as well is that if I access this on my cell phone and log into the same Google account, that this will be reflected on my phone. You're welcome to go and test this application. I'll put the link into chat now, and you can engage with it and maybe see if you can use it on your phone and on your desktop. I think that's honestly all I have for now. Does anyone have any questions? Is there anything anyone would like me to go through if I ran over something too quickly? Okay, Martin, I'm not sure how you'd like to wrap today up, etc., or if you'd like me to do anything else, but that's kind of all I have to display for today.
Thank you very much, Dane, for coming today. Everyone, if you have any questions, please pop them up in the chat or just unmute yourself. Yeah, for me, it was like pretty hectic because I couldn't it was too fast.
Okay, for sure.
Yeah, but it's cool. I'm not sure if you're gonna upload all what you have done now.
I 100% can push all my changes that I've made to that repo, and then you can go through the code. If you'd like, I can highlight I can highlight kind of the authentication. Really, there are a few methods that you care about in your application, but I'll push all those changes to the repo, and then if anybody needs that, they can go through that.
Cool. Yeah. Everyone, I'm just gonna be posting a feedback link in the chat. We really value your feedback, so please fill in the feedback form. Yeah, so I can improve our events. Cool.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I hope it was an insightful experience at the very least. Yeah, I hope you well on your journey into development or management or whatever sphere of walk of life that you're getting into. Thanks, guys.
Big thanks, Dane. And thank you, everyone, for coming.